Thank you very much for those remarks and for getting us started on what I think will be a very lively discussion. Our first respondent is Rita Sherma, who is the founding director and associate professor at the Center for Dharma Studies here at the GTU. She also serves on the core doctoral faculty, is co-chair of the Sustainability 360 initiative here at the GTU. Formerly, she was the Swami Vivekananda visiting professor in Hindu studies at USC Los Angeles. She holds an MA in Women's Studies and Religion and a PhD in Theology and Ethics from Claremont Graduate University. Rita is a co-founder of the American Academy of Religions, Hinduism Program Unit, founding vice president of DANAM, the Dharma Academy of North America, a scholarly society for research on Hinduism, Hindu, Buddhist, and Jain religious and interreligious studies, and serves as vice president of the Society for Hindu Christian Studies. Dr. Sherma has authored, co-edited numerous books, and he's the founding editor-in-chief of the Journal of Dharma Studies. She serves on the editorial board of Reading Religion Journal, an AAR publication, and advisor to the Department of the World Religions Climate Action sponsored Faith for the Earth online print project, as well as the advisory board of the Yale Forum for Religion and Ecology. Rita, please take it away.
Thank you so much for this wonderful event, CTNS. So the title of my response is Critical Theory and Theological Hermeneutics, Economy, Economics, Ecology, and Emancipation. And I want to bring in this concept because this is where a very widespread global effort in theology is ongoing. So first of all, I want to talk about Richard Norgaard's commentary. And I don't want to go through all the details because he just spoke, but I do want to note some of the things that he said, which I personally found, extremely compelling. So he notes that we need democratic governance informed by real and ethical understanding to insist that the rights to act in the market, essentially property rights, are defined and enforced to reach public goals. We need a new systemic understanding of reality and morality, and both of them have spoken about the issue of climate crisis and the poly crisis we're facing as a moral issue. In effect, what he suggests is that we need, in effect, a change of consciousness to see and put into effect property rules to achieve a sustainable and equitable economy that provides meaningful lives. He goes on to say that he argues that economic beliefs has become the religion of modernity, which is what it is the main thesis here, that it's the religion. It has become our religion. And so what you have is, idolatry, displacing the beliefs about care for others, even strangers, the importance of helping the poor, and the sins of disproportionate wealth that are prominent in the Abrahamic traditions, but not just the Abrahamic traditions, but also, I would say, the dharmic traditions, indigenous traditions, and other spiritual. Okay, so he just went over this, so I'm not going to do that. But all I want to say is all of these points can be and are challenged by principles and insights, doctrines in all the traditions that we study here at the GTU. So I want to go forward to some of the things that Dan Smith talked about very briefly. I can't go through all of it, but I do want to just mention a few key points. I found, again, his presentation compelling. It's very likely, he notes, that we are seeing some of these effects already, that is the effects of climate change. However, one might ask, why is this a religious problem? And why should faith communities care about climate change at all? So climate change in public discourse, he notes, is usually framed as a scientific problem, treated as so hopelessly complex that the average layperson could never understand it. But really, the reason it gets so much attention is that folks have strong feelings that it points, again, he also notes this, that it's a moral problem, which has gone largely unaddressed in the modern world, the relationship of human beings to the planet. But he goes on to say something additional. He says that today, I mean, even to have planetary awareness is relatively recent, and to add to it moral responsibility feels like a little bit much to the average observer. So part of our problem today is the challenge of having an ethical framework that takes into account our actual place in the universe and our power over nature. But let's look at that. The issue of planetary awareness, it depends on the tradition. Indigenous traditions have a sense of planetary awareness as intrinsic to their cosmological, cosmotheandric vision. And the moral responsibility is also integral to many Indigenous traditions and certainly to certain dharmic traditions as well. And so it depends what part of the world we're looking at, which is why I think this effort cannot be only done in silos. This is why this effort needs to be an interreligious effort where we are in dialogue. And so I will continue. Part of my response here is coming actually from my book, Religion and Sustainability, Interreligious Resources, Interdisciplinary Responses, to which many of our faculty who are present there have contributed. It was part of the United Nations SDG book series and 2022. Let me just quickly respond here briefly. This part is, I'm citing myself from the book. Research has begun to examine the helpful practices, principles, practices, aesthetics, and moral and ethical insights of the religious worlds of humanity that are relevant to action on our current crises. However, the concern is not only the non-integration of the spiritual dimension of the human life in the effort to reorient economies for sustainable development and growth thus far. The concern is also about the very concept of sustainability itself, ecological sustainability. What is it that is being sustained? Do we want to sustain endless dependence on current economic models? Or is it time to reconsider the entire project of unlimited development? Perhaps the idea of sustainable societies, which includes the economic, ecological, moral, theoethical, and contemplative facets of human life, which this volume that I spoke about, this volume represents, can help anchor communities to a relationship with the earth beyond extraction and exploitation. So just to present, where I am speaking from, my research in constructive theological vision is embedded at the intersection of Hindu liberation theology and ecofeminist philosophy, and it identifies, or my work identifies and integrates principles, paradigms, and practices within the Vedic traditions that speak to it in its indigenous and integral vision to create a Hindu critical theology. I also engage deeply in research with many colleagues across the world that involves interreligious, dialogical, liberative, and ecological theologies in this time of complex polycrisis, a term that Richard used very effectively. So what are critical theories and what is its relationship to liberative faith? Emancipatory critical theologies are the orientations in modern faith that offer the greatest hope for visionary liberative spiritualities that integrate equitable economics and ecological sustainability into frameworks that support human flourishing, but also planetary flourishing. So what are the links between critical theory and liberative theologies? Well, they share a common goal of analyzing and critiquing oppressive power structures and systems of oppression overall that aim for liberation and social justice. Both critical theory and liberative faith approach and utilize social analysis to understand how oppressive power operates and to seek to offer empowerment at the margins. So critical theory, most of you are very familiar with it, I'm sure, is a critique of social, political, and economic systems. Second, it exposes structural injustice and not just individual injustice of class, region, race, gender, economic, and ecological harm. Third is that it challenges unregulated capitalism, neoliberalism, neocolonial extractivism, and it seeks transformation for justice and sustainability. Now, so what is theological hermeneutics? Because this is where both of them meet. So interpretation of texts and of sacred texts in context, of course, it asks who interprets, for whom is this interpretation, under what realities is this interpretation. It bridges ancient wisdom with ethical crises. It brings ancient wisdom into engagement with ethical crises, the polycrises that we're in: poverty, climate change, economic injustice, environmental degradation, the biogeophysical wreckage of the earth. So now, how do they meet? How do they meet? How does critical theological hermeneutics arise? So this is the use of critical theory to read religious traditions for justice. And I'd say compassion. It exposes economic and ecological oppression in texts and institutions and applications, interpretations. It seeks liberative interpretations. For example, it uses moments like structures like Sabbath, Jubilee, Exodus for liberative purposes. For example, there's an entire theological work by Professor Garth Baker Fletcher, who's a theologian, black theologian, and his liberative theology is called Exodus theology. So the other major critical theology is feminist theology, which speaks to emancipatory economics and ecology. It critiques patriarchy and capitalist commodification. It highlights women's burden in climate change and women's particular burden of poverty, which is greater across the world. Ecofeminism links the oppression of women in nature. It shows how it begins early in the Enlightenment and how it continued. And then one of the major thinkers who is my mentor is Rosemary Radford Ruther. One of her books that begins to really deal with this deeply, of course, is the famous Gaia and God. So ecofeminism is interesting because it's not a Western model anymore. Ecofeminism is now East, West, North, South. Is a global model, an indigenous model as well now. And it has been taken up as a social movement and philosophy that looks at the connections between nature and women in terms of perception, as a social movement that centers on the protection of nature. It is a movement led by decolonial and indigenous movements, primarily by women of color activists across the world. In theory, it considers how the oppression of women and the domination of nature are interlinked, are theoretically, philosophically, practically interlinked. And it is a term coined in 1974 by the French feminist philosopher Françoise Daubonne. Ecofeminist theorists, such as the pioneer Indian Hindu physicist Vandana Shiva, argue how the oppression of women in nature are interlinked due to systemic capitalist patriarchy. This is a picture of Chipko Andolan. This is showing how ecofeminism global movement. I won't waste time on it, but these women got what is called the alternate Nobel Prize, and they were on the long list for the Nobel. And it's a movement of village women who saved entire forests. The forest conservation movement in India, led by both male and female activists and major leaders. But most importantly, the indigenous women of the Himalayan region of Uttarakhand, were deeply involved, as I show in this photo. And the idea of tree hugging comes from the Chipko movement. So the one other major theoretical branch of critical theology is Black liberation theology, which deals with economics, ecology, and of course, civil rights. And it looks at liberation from racial and economic oppression, how the two are linked. It works on environmental justice, that is freedom from toxic waste and urban pollution. Think of Flint, Michigan. And of course, a major voice in this discipline is James Cone. One of his seminal books is The Cross and the Lynching Tree. Black liberation theology connects economic justice to the broader fight for racial equality and liberation from oppression. It emphasizes the pursuit of social, economic, and political justice for Black communities, aiming for equality in all aspects of life. This becomes theopraxis and theojustice, theoethics. BLT often criticizes existing economic systems that perpetuate inequality and advocates for alternative models that prioritize the needs of marginalized communities. It is now in contact with Latin American and African indigenous models. Then, of course, the most notable liberation theology model is that of the Latin American liberation theology and its decolonial turn in today's world. It deals with economics, ecology, with a particular emphasis on the poor and the indigenous. It emerged in poverty, exploitation, and repression, political repression. And of course, the famous term that it uses is preferential option for the poor. Its environmental concerns are particularly with deforestation and extraction. So major voices in this are multiple, but one famous voice is, of course, Bernardo Boff, with his seminal book, Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor. He says in there this beautiful, quote, "You discover the earth's springing energy, its amazing beauty, its most excellent potency. But to praise your creator, you make the earth's cry your own." And then we, of course, have to touch on Gustavo Gutierrez, who is thought of as the father of Latin American liberation theology. And what is that according to him? Liberation theology was intended as a call to all believers in Latin America to act on the biblical commitment to the poor. Gutierrez's message on material and economic conditions serves to place inequality in both the religious and political discourse. And then you have, of course, eco-theology. Eco-theology, a across traditions, Abrahamic traditions, Dharmic traditions, indigenous traditions, Taoism, Chinese traditions. We find eco-theology everywhere now. And of course, it deals with ecology and economics and the issue of climate change. It tries to interrogate economic models driving climate collapse. It advocates for ecological conservation, ecological sustainability, climate justice, and of course, environmental justice. Calls for new economies of sufficiency, care, and solidarity. Major thinkers in Christian traditions include Sally McFaig, Thomas Berry, Jürgen Moltmann, John Cobb, another of my mentors from Claremont, and Cynthia Molabita, our own Dr. Molabita here at GTU. Dharma ecology, Buddhist names, Joanna Macy, Gary Schneider, and of course, David Loy. Eco-dharma in the Hindu world, just a smattering of people. There's a very large number of people working on this, but just some names: Kenneth Valpy, my friend from Oxford, our own alum, Kojin, Dr. Kojin Bohanek, and in all humility, myself. So what are the common themes across all of these critical liberation theologies across the world and across traditions? It's number one is contextuality. That is, yes, we have universal principles across our traditions. We claim that they are universal value and application, but the critical theologies insist that we also contextualize them, shape them by economic and ecological realities. Second, liberation from oppression. Social, political, economic, even spiritual oppression. 3, economic justice, ecological sustainability. 4, praxis, that is reflection plus eco-political action. Solidarity with marginalized peoples, but also the marginalized ecosystems of the earth. Activism as a form of praxis. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you in particular to Richard Nergard and Dan Smith for your brilliant work.
Thank you very much, Rita. We have some time now for our fellows to engage in conversation with you about your comments. So I'll open the floor up to Dan and Richard if you have anything to say.
So I'm not sure I'm speaking out loudly enough, but let's see. Thank you. You've definitely brought in dimensions that my talk failed to have. I very much appreciate what you're adding in. And at the feminist dimension, I think in my original write-up, I did have comments about mostly men in the economics profession and in these early natural theology, the early beginnings. But men and the man's perspective dominates the troubles we are in. I'm a little bit frustrated with liberation as a concept, because I think we need to stress that we need to be in relation with. And so I believe in, yes, we need to liberate women from the dominance. We need to liberate indigenous people from the dominance of modernity that's evolved out of fraternal thinking, male thinking. I guess how to spin that into relationality. And Leonard Boff does a fantastic job of showing linkages while also using the term liberation, and he's critically important to the liberation theology, critically important to the understandings of the late Pope Francis. But I'm still curious how we transition into relationality with each other with freedom and liberation as our dominant language?
You know, it's interesting you say that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 When I first encountered the words liberation theology, I thought to myself, the telos in the Hindu spiritual world is mukti or moksha, which literally translates to liberation. But the question is liberation from what and liberation into what? So it was a liberation from ignorance, ontological ignorance of our connectedness to the divine and to the world. It's liberation from that ignorance and liberation into the knowledge of our relationality to the divine and to the earth and to all the human and more than human world. I just published a paper recently called Relationality and Reverence, which was about this very topic. And when we think of Buddhism, what is the primary doctrine is pratitya samutpada, which is codependent co-arising, mutual causality, in other words, interrelationship. So, but this term has been, with Gustavo Gutierrez and others who followed him, use this term because they're seeking to free themselves, they're seeking emancipation. This is the title of my response was Economics, Ecology, and Emancipation. They're seeking emancipation from the chains that are around these people and these ecosystems because of economic malfeasance and economic malrelationship with the earth and with the planetary community, human and greater than human. So I think that we can integrate the concepts of interrelationality with the concept of emancipation and join it together for more holistic vision. Thank you for bringing that up. Appreciate it.
I would also like to thank you for your comments. I appreciated what you had to say specifically about in traditions other than Christianity, especially the indigenous traditions that you mentioned. There is a more natural link to the natural world as a source of wisdom, which is something I'm seeking. I actually think it's kind of a hidden part of the Christian tradition that we've kind of forgotten. It's very important. I guess I'm curious, what a big part of the Christian tradition is on these thorny issues of ecology, social justice, conversion. We'll talk about this, like even Rosemary Redford Rita says this. I'm familiar with that book in our work, I Am God, conversion to the earth. So I'm actually kind of curious from the Dharma perspective, from our Hinduism, is there a concept of conversion, of turning away from sin to a new way of thinking or being? Because I think it's an element of rewiring. I mean, Larry Rasmussen says this beautifully. You can't fix a problem with the mentality that caused it. And the mentality is assault and abuse. As he was like, this is the common link, as I understand it, between in ecofeminism. But I'm specifically curious about the conversion question. I mean, is that something that the Hindus will talk about?
Conversion, you're talking about missiology?
No, turning away from sin, like
You're talking about that theological conversion.
Yeah.
So it's a different model, right? So dharma, the word dharma is an interesting word. I mean, it has multiple meanings in Buddhism and it has multiple meanings in Hinduism. But one of the meanings is responsibility, duty.
Okay.
And so and there are four what's the word I'm looking for? Four aims of human life. It goes dharma, artha, kama, moksha. Okay, so dharma I will come to in a minute. Artha is flourishing. It's material flourishing. In other words, wealth and comfort and all the things every human seeks. Kama is refined living. It is, not smashing a burger into one's mouth, but, you know, eating in a refined way, because it's mindful living. Karma is the mindful engagement with every aspect of life. And the thing is that when we do that, we are less likely to be in mal relationship with our fellow humans and the, you know, greater than human world. So that's karma. And then you have moksha, which is a spiritual liberation I just spoke about, which is communion with the divine, union with the reality as a whole, to recognize that we're not separate from, but actually just an emergent phenomena of this one divinely created reality. That's moksha. But dharma is at the very beginning of all this, not at the end or middle, because dharma is everything. Because if we can't live in a way that is responsible, none of this can happen. So dharma facilitates moksha, facilitates spiritual liberation, and it regulates artha and kama, that is material life. So the Hindu perspective is not on rights, but on responsibilities. And the point is that if we are in relationship with right relationship, again, a term very common in Buddhism, with everything in our world, people, things, the earth, if we're in right relationship with it, it means we are in responsible relationship. If all of us maintain our responsibilities to ourselves, our families, our arenas of enterprise, such as teaching or economics or medicine, whatever, then we don't have to worry about you don't have to worry about your congregation's rights. You have to worry about your responsibility, whether it's being met, whether your responsibility to them is being met. If it's being met, you don't have to worry about their rights. So this is the relationship Hinduism expects of every human on, you know, in engagement with the world.
That's really, I mean, the congregation president, my current congregation has been talking for the last year or so. I think this is brilliant. We talk a lot about the Bill of Rights in the United States, the rights that I have as an individual. He said, actually, a Catholic priest told him this, what we need is a bill of responsibilities. Because being in a society, there's give and take. Of course, we have rights. I can assert my rights, but I also have responsibility for the well-being of my brothers and sisters, including, you know, the planetary wellness. And that really is not foreign to Christianity, but it's become foreign because it's been co-opted by a lot of other interests. So that's thank you, because I actually had a follow-up question about limits, and I think you might have answered the question. Like, what was our concept of limits? And it sounds like the limits are the relationship itself.
Well, there's also this concept of debt. You know, that we're said to have 4 debts in the Hindu world. We have a debt to our ancestors. That is, they, you know, we have received all these gifts of the sciences, for example, all of us. How do we use it? Do we use it wisely? Okay? Yeah. That's your debt to your ancestor. Then we have a debt to God, to the divine, for obvious reasons. And then we have a debt to the planetary community, because it sustains us. We have a debt to it. Then we have a debt to our descendants, not necessarily your or my children, them too, of course, but the whole world's children. We have a debt to future generations. So this idea of responsibilities is connected, so dharma is connected to the idea of rina, which is debts. These 4 debts.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. Yeah.
I think Richard has his hand up.
My mind is going in many different directions. And this is good. This is very good, Dr. Sherma. But I guess I'm still concerned that this liberation leads, this emancipation leads to something that's clearly unitary. Whereas I tend to have a much more methodological pluralism view of the world, a and cultural pluralism. And within the concepts of eco-civilization, there's much more pluralism in culture is, you know, sort of allowed, is encouraged in many ways. And it's really in Western civilization, but of course also in China, also in India, where you get dominance of worldviews competing with other worldviews, that some become dominant. And I'm going to argue that it's the dominance that becomes the problem. That in that worldview, we might become emancipated, you know, liberated towards. We might still end up abusing each other in nature. And it'd be much better to have multiple experiments going on.
Well, I mean, I have to mention my friend, Professor Arturo Escobar. He is a famous Latin American, but he's in the United States, but he's a Latin American origin. He is a pioneering voice in decoloniality studies. I love his concept of the pluriverse. Now, the pluriverse, I don't think it even requires explanation. You know, from that word, we're looking for a tapestry. We're not looking for a white sheet, brown sheet, whatever. We're looking for a tapestry, right? That's the pluriverse. And so this concept, I think, is familiar in China. You have this, I'm going to mispronounce because I don't speak Chinese, but this concept of Sanjiu Hei, which is the three teachings, that everybody was Buddhist and Confucian and Taoist because they complemented each other in people's lives. Then in India, you have an entire landscape where people are Hindu and Buddhist and Jain and Hindu and Sikh and Hindu and Jain and Buddhist, and you know, taking part in each other's religious worlds and cultural worlds and regional worlds. And it was normative. And I published a volume called Hermeneutics and Hindu Thought Towards a Fusion of Horizons, inspired by Gadamer. And one of my contributors wrote, this is the title, The Hermeneutics of the Word Religion and Its Disastrous Effect on India's Spiritual Landscape. Because these were not different religions, they were paths. And you could be on multiple paths. You could be on this path today and that path tomorrow, and your mother could be in that path, your father could be in another one. Everything's fine. Everything is fine. It's a pluriverse. But then the British census comes in the early 1900s and says, you can only be one thing. What are you? Because for tax purposes, we need this sorted out. We need a last name and we need your religion. And it breaks up this entire pluriverse. So pluriversal way of life, it was been common in many parts of the world for many millennia, and including in things like the Ottoman Empire. But when you break that and you had the beginning of the Young Turks and coming in with secular Turkey, you have the Armenian genocide, right? So pluriverses are possible even under empire, but it has to be a mindset. I'm okay, you're okay. So yes, thank you for that. Thank you both so very much. Very grateful for your insights.
Thank you very much for mentioning Arturo. I remember him when I was a grad student, and I've spoken in his classes a couple
He's
times.
wonderful.
He's an incredible thinker.
Well, I appreciate the rich discussion, but I think in order to keep on track, we should take a break. So thank you very much, Rita. We're going to reconvene in